Welcome to the Book of Judges. Now, my wife's grandpa, he's a judge. He's got the robes, the gavel, the whole 9 yards. But he's nothing like Shamgar or Jephthah. And that's probably a good thing. Now, while the text of Judges does hint that settling disputes between Israelites was part of the job description of a judge, their primary role was that of a warrior. They were warriors raised up by God to deliver Israel from oppressors who afflicted them during this age. Now, these warriors marked a transition in the history of Israel's leadership from the time of Moses and Joshua, in between that and that of the kings, which ran, of course, all the way up into the exile. Now, these judges were empowered by God's Spirit to do God's will in their generation, which sounds great. But we're going to learn pretty quickly this was not a positive time in Israel's history. You see, over the course of the 350 or so years covered in this book, we are going to witness Israel just descend into political disintegration and chaos. In chapters 1 and 2, their land is stripped away bit by bit. And then here in the center section, Israel is going to descend into tribalism and regionalism. They're going to be bickering among themselves, the 12 tribes. And then finally, in 19 to 21, here at the end, Israel is just going to implode in all-out civil war. It's a disaster. Well, this book, as just indicated, is divided into 3 parts. We got an introduction, a body, and a conclusion. Isn't that convenient? Now, both the introduction and the conclusion, or we'll call it the epilogue, have 2 parts, a matching double intro, double conclusion, and it's quite interesting, the relationship between the 2 of them. And then, of course, in this large center section, 3 to 16, we have the well-known stories of Israel's judges, Deborah, Gideon, Samson, and all the rest. Well, Judges chapter 1, verse 1 is going to pick up right where Joshua left off with his death. Take a look at this. Judges 1:1. After the death of Joshua, the people of Israel had a job to do. They had to finish what Joshua started and complete the conquest. And so they inquire of the Lord. That's a good thing, isn't it? "O Yahweh, who shall go up first for us to fight against the Canaanites?" And Yahweh answered, and Yahweh said, Judah shall go up first. And you know what? Judah does a great job. He teams up with Simeon, and the Lord gave the Canaanites into their hand. Fantastic. What a great way to start the book. Now who's next? Joseph, the house of Joseph, went up against Bethel. And you know what? The Lord was with him. More positive stuff. We like this. And they went up and they scouted. He sent out spies who scouted out the city of Bethel. And they saw a man coming out of Bethel and said, "Hey, let us know how to get in your city and we'll deal kindly with you." And just like Rahab, they do. They sack the city, but they let that man go. I mean, this is just like the story of Joshua and Jericho. This is fantastic. But then everything begins to change in verse 27. Oh no, look at this. Manasseh did not drive out the inhabitants of Beth Shean. And then Ephraim did not drive out the Canaanites. Zebulun failed to drive out more inhabitants of the land. Asher, Naphtali, Dan. Here we have Judges chapter 1 highlighting 7 different failed conquest attempts by the tribes of Israel. Now, Israel did pretty good in the hill country, kind of the center strip of the land of Israel, but they really struggled on the coast, the lowland. Let me show you what I mean. Areas where Israel was very successful. It is the hill country, the kind of hilly area here, except for a couple of corridors. One corridor reaching to Jerusalem. They weren't able to drive out the Hivites and the Jebusites from this area. And then, as we just read, Manasseh struggled to drive out the Canaanites from Beth Shean. And now this area right here, the Jezreel Valley, is going to be very important for both Deborah and Gideon to come. But the primary area that Israel just couldn't get a grasp on was the lowland, the coastal territory, dominated by the Philistines in the south and the Canaanites in the north. Now, Judah, his excuse for failing to drive out the people of the land was pretty pathetic. He says that people of Judah could not drive out the inhabitants of the plain because they had chariots of iron. Now, were chariots much of a problem for Yahweh back in the book of Exodus? You can think of a few hundred chariots at the bottom of the Red Sea that say, no, they weren't. You see, the problem, of course, was not chariots. The problem was faith. Now, this lack of faith is highlighted in Yahweh's condemnation of this failed conquest in the first 5 verses of chapter 2. Take a look at the visit of the angel of the Lord to the gathered tribes of Israel here. The assembly. The angel of the Lord went up from Gilgal to Bochim, which means weeping, by the way. He says, I brought you out of the land of Egypt, and I said to you, you shall make no covenant with the inhabitants of the land. Don't do that. And you shall break down their altars. But look what he says next. You have not obeyed my voice. Evidently, they did make covenants with the inhabitants of the land, and they failed to break down those altars. And therefore, what's Yahweh going to do? How is he going to respond? Because you have not obeyed my voice, I will not drive out the inhabitants from the land anymore. But these inhabitants, these Canaanites, Perizzites, Jebusites, they will become thorns in your sides, and their gods will be a snare to you. I mean, this is terrible news. Israel begins to weep and cry and wail. They sacrifice to Yahweh, but it's too late. And this bad news is going to characterize the rest of the book of Judges. Israel is going to be ensnared by foreign gods time after time, and again they are going to feel the sting of the thorn of these enemy nations in their side. Now, this cyclical nature of Israel's sin is highlighted for us and explained in great detail in the second introduction in 2:6 to 3:6. And it's going to open with another flashback to the death of Joshua. It's repeated twice here in these chapters, but this time, this flashback is a word-for-word quotation from the book of Joshua. It's just this extended paragraph quoted word for word. Let me show you. Kind of strange that the Bible likes to plagiarize itself. So, Judges is going to copy the book of Joshua 2 times. The first time, in the initial introduction, considers Caleb's invitation to anyone in Israel who goes up and defeats the city of Kiriath Sefer. He's like, I will give you my daughter for a wife. Aksha, she's amazing. And then Othniel says, hey, sure, I'll go do it. And he captures the city, and then he gets Aksha for his wife, and then they get some additional personal inheritance. Pretty neat, and it's important for the next section, so tuck that one away. The second direct copy quotation from the book of Joshua, this time it's chapter 24, is in chapter 2, which highlights the death of Joshua. The son of Nun, servant of the Lord, died being 110 years old. Now, the purpose of this quotation is to respond to verse 31, in my opinion, from Joshua 24, which is one of the last verses of the whole book of Joshua. Joshua has 33 verses in its final chapter, and here in verse 31, we read that Israel served Yahweh all the days of Joshua. Woohoo! And all the days of the elders who outlived Joshua. Yes! But the question is, what about those who came after them? And that question is tragically answered for us in the very next verse here in Judges chapter 2. So here's this quotation. We yanked verse 31 and we kind of slapped it up here in Judges 2:7. But let's look at Judges 2:10 to see what happens after the elders died who outlived Joshua. Scroll down here. And all that generation also, the elders who outlived Joshua, they were gathered to their fathers too. They died. And then another generation rose up after them who did not know Yahweh or his work. And what happens next? The people of Israel, this next generation, they did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. They didn't know Yahweh's works. Now this ignorance of the Lord and his work is going to initiate a cycle of rebellion against the Lord. Israel is going to do evil in his sight. They're going to worship other gods, commit idolatry. And then the only way that Yahweh knows to draw Israel back to himself is to send oppressors who afflict them and cause Israel to repent and cry out to Yahweh for deliverance. And of course, Yahweh, who is always eager to save, he hears that cry and he sends a spirit-empowered deliverer, a judge, to save Israel from their oppressors. And as long as that judge is alive, Israel has rest and peace in the land until they fall victim once again to idolatry and apostasy, and the cycle starts over again. Now, this cycle is repeated 7 times in the book of Judges. Take a look at this chart. 7 times we have this cycle of sin, salvation, and Israel crying out. So the initial cycle, here we are, we have 7. The initial one is just kind of like an outline. This is what we just went over in chapter 2 that kind of says this is what you're going to witness in the rest of the book. And then in chapters 3 down to 16, the middle section of the book, we have 6 more cycles for each of the 6 major judges in this book. Now, each of these cycles are going to employ certain stock phrases or stock language. The first of which, highlighting Israel's sin, it's going to say Israel did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, and that kind of cues you in. That gives you a signal. Okay, we're starting another cycle. And then Israel is going to sell, or he's going to give Israel into the hand. God is going to give Israel into the hand of their enemies, Cushan Rishathaim, or Moab, Canaan, Midian, for a certain number of years. Israel served Cushan Rishathaim of Mesopotamia for 8 years, and then Moab for 18 years. But then, after a prayer in which Israel cries out, the same verb is used in each of these instances, Yahweh is going to raise up a deliverer who's going to save them for another period of time. Now, there's a certain scholar, his name's Conrad Schmidt, and he makes a fascinating observation about these cycles. Let's read this quote from Conrad Schmidt. Now, he says that the judges cycle, each of these cycles, is noteworthy within the larger story of Joshua all the way to Kings, or really you could start in Exodus all the way to Kings, which itself tells a story of salvation from slavery to destruction, leading to peace in the promised land, only to end up again with foreign oppression and ultimately exile. Now, he's talking about salvation from Egypt, and then peace in the land, and then finally exile in Babylon. That is the whole macro story of Israel, kind of in a short nutshell. But then Conrad is going to continue, Schmidt, and he's going to say that within this large narrative, the book of Judges explores how each generation, each one of these cycles, faced its own experience of sin, leading to oppression, resulting in judgment, and then finally salvation. Each one of these cycles is an experience of the whole history of Israel in miniature. Isn't that interesting? I think that's a very valid observation. Well, if only these cycles of sin and salvation were as bad as it got in the book of Judges, well, then maybe that would be tolerable. But the thing is, it gets a whole lot worse than that. You see, in Judges 2, verse 19, we're told that as soon as a judge died, then Israel would become more corrupt. They would turn back and become more corrupt than their fathers, going after other gods, serving them and bowing down to them. Each cycle was worse than the one that came before it. And therefore, the book of Judges is not just a merry-go-round, not just a cycle happening again and again. No, it's not a merry-go-round. It's a downward spiral leading up to just Israel blowing up here at the end of the book. But praise God for his unchanging, ever-faithful grace. And this grace, this eagerness to save Israel when they cry out to him, is captured in the structure, the inherent structure in this second introduction to the book of Judges. Take a look at a structure composed by David Dorsey. David Dorsey, in The Literary Structure of the Old Testament, a very helpful book. Look how he has arranged this introduction 2:6 to 3:6 into kind of a modified chiasm, where we have these experiences of sin and judgment in BC, and then sin and judgment again. But then at the very center of this entire section is Yahweh's gracious intervention, him raising up a judge who saved Israel from their oppressors. Now, Yahweh's grace, it is going to be magnified again and again throughout this book, despite Israel's sin. And then, of course, the depth of Israel's sin and apostasy and rebellion against Yahweh only serves to demonstrate the height, the surpassing greatness of Yahweh's grace, his love, and his mercy for Israel. Now, both of these themes, sin and Yahweh's mercy, are going to be treated in case study after case study after case study in Judges 3 to 16, the body of the book, which we will take a look at next.